Justin Gorton, our Director of Basin Studies at the GSQ. Justin has 12 years' experience in the oil and gas industry in North America and Australia. He's the current president of the Formation Evaluation Society of Queensland, FESQ or FESQ. So today, Justin, we're talking about the new Petroleum and Gas reporting guidelines, which, as I alluded to in my presentation, I think are fundamentally important to the way we do business in this state. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. You probably would have heard this morning Tony and I talk about data-driven exploration and probably a little bit about geoscience data and some of the modernization work they're trying to do. So what I'm going to do is actually dig a little bit deeper, pardon the pun, and talk about how that data is actually received to us and what we do with it. So I guess that's that first piece of the picture is about the reporting guidelines. It's about getting the right data and getting it in the right format and to the right standards and so on. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Just to give a bit of a background on the timeline, so this has had a bit of a history. It actually started before 2016 with the first release in 2015, and it was a fairly good document which described quite a bit of content and some clarifications around the regulation. Although the regulation was fairly specific on a number of things, it was not so specific on others. So I think the guideline, the first guideline really helped to tie things together. So in 2016, we had a look at the guideline, where it was sitting, and we really, at that point, were just trying to preserve the current state. We wanted to clarify additional things in the regulation that still needed to be described and specified a little bit better in the guideline. And we really wanted to focus on digital lodgement. So you'll know that the first templates or submission templates that were developed were for production and reserves. We hadn't changed anything in the regulation. We hadn't changed the frequency, the granularity of the reporting. It was as it is, but in a digital form. And that really helped to improve the efficiency in the way that we received that data. We actually had people that were there transcribing data from PDFs into spreadsheets. So by getting that spreadsheet in the first place, by having validations in the spreadsheet, and then as it's ingested, it's really helped to improve the quality of the data. It's helped to improve the efficiency of the data transfer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation, because we really want to scale up in that space. We really want to build better validation on ingestion so that we can verify quality as we've received the data and we can make a decision on it. So in 2017, we drafted a new reporting guideline. In that guideline, it had, again, more improved specifications. One thing we were aiming to do with it was to reduce the report body. We didn't want a lot of duplication in the report. For example, we had embedded tables in the PDF main body of the report, but we also had tables that were submitted in spreadsheets. Sometimes those tables were even provided in, ancillary reports that were attached to the appendices. So we just didn't feel that there was really any need to duplicate it. And whilst having all that main data sitting in the body of the report was quite useful, and it is still useful to look at it on a well-by-well basis if you're trying to analyze fields, if you're trying to analyze plays, it's really not that useful. You want to be able to extract the bulk of that data. So we looked at the development of submission templates, and in 2017 we released both the draft templates and the draft guideline for consultation. Consultation lasted for about 3 months, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it was actually ongoing. Even in 2018 we had additional consultation, and towards the end an information session, so I can go into detail later in the presentation. With that was the end of the creation of the final reporting guideline. We say it's final, but we're actually in a transition period, so I'll talk about that. But during that time, in between 2017 and 2018, we worked with those templates, tested compatibility, and again, that goes in more detail later on. What I wanted to do, and I've used this slide a number of times, is to very simply describe what I see as the current state, but I also see it as the problem state, in that where we have data that's being collected in the field, represented by these images. The first one at the top, as obvious, being geoscience. The middle icon there, which looks like a drill bit, is the engineering data, and the third icon is the operational information. And we know the industry collects this information in various different ways. It may be in reports, it may be automated and streamlined into databases. There's various different ways that information is received. But ultimately, some of that information goes into a database that's held by the companies. Then some of that data, again, is extracted and put into the report. And when you unpack that on our end of that black line as government, we then take that report and we manually extract, or have been manually extracting that data and entering some of that into the database. So each stage you talk about data handling. You've got the point of where you've acquired it. You've got the point of which it's been captured. Some of that actually might be manual transcription. You've got the point of getting it into a report. Again, there might be some manual transcription. So you've got issues of introducing error at every stage from acquisition to the point of receipt. And our end, it's exactly the same. And I can look at our database now. What we used to release is QPED, and we kept updating. Having a look at that database, there is a lot of erroneous data that's gotten in there, and probably the big reason for that is data handling. So what we want to do is reduce that. Ultimately, having data flowing from database to database makes sense. How do we get there? There's various different ways of doing that. We talk a lot about cloud technology. I think that's generally the way of the future, and certainly in terms of storage costs it is, particularly for the bigger data sets that we're acquiring. Some of the intent and drivers for change. So the intent was really to enhance the content and to reduce duplication. Enhancing the content provides better information for explorers to make discoveries, new discoveries. Reducing duplication saves costs, both within industry and government. Optimizing the data transfer and efficiency and utility. Again, that is a cost impact. Getting that data in and out of systems should be really efficient, or as efficient as possible. Improving the data quality by reducing data handling, that's one way, but we also want to look at introducing better validation on ingestion. Some of the drivers, obviously mentioned reducing costs, increasing in industry investment, having better data out there, discoverable, and of course better and more informed decisions. And that's lots of various different decisions. You know, a lot of those decisions are investment decisions that industry make, but also decisions that government make, you know, around energy policy, around land use, and so on. So I talked about this engagement. So in 2017, we rolled out an engagement plan for the new reporting guideline, and there was around 35 industry representatives that were included in that. Some of the companies that were included are listed as these icons up there. So you had a fairly good mix of major producers, and you had a number of what you call sort of junior explorers or emerging producers. And we also had Peak Body, APIA, and PISA involved. So during that period between September and November 2017, when the draft guidelines were released and the templates, we had quite a lot of feedback coming back from I think, of quite a good representation or a good representative sample of industry, from service providers to small companies up to major producers. Generally, the response, some of the positive feedback we received was that there was a general support for the intent of what we were doing and the management of industry geoscience data. And there was also a general support for the lodgement of data via templates. And in fact, that idea didn't come from me originally. I can't take claim to that. It actually came from industry, and it came from numerous people. So I hope that we're actually delivering what was being asked. Some of the key issues that were raised during that consultation, I'll put them out there. There were a number of them. There was various different degrees. Some were fairly small and some were quite major. What I wanted to do was distill down to some of the key ones and reduce some of that duplication in the responses. So I guess one of the first things that came out of it was the onerous reporting of operational information for producing wells. The idea behind introducing that in the draft guideline was to be able to get some context about a well's production, you know, the completions that were in the well, the operations of the well, and various other bits of information that would help identify why one well is producing better than the other than the geology. So the intent was right, but the way it was delivered probably wasn't right at that time. So I'll talk about what we've done with that. There was a need for a transition period. Industry recognized it was going to take them a bit of time to transition to these new requirements. They have to adapt their systems, they have to adapt their processes, they might even need to upskill people. So I think it was quite apparent that there needed to be that transition period. Raw data prioritized over interpretation data. I think generally most of the reports do focus on raw data, but there is still a bit of interpretation information in there. There were some discussions around the commercial sensitivity of contingent and prospective resources. So really as a state, we need to know where our resources are. By asking to collect that, that's one thing, but also the confidentiality of that comes into importance. So we need to discuss a way of how we can still collect that data and how it should be used and whether and how it should be distributed. The burden of reporting production data by well, reporting production data by well provides a lot of benefits. I can talk about that but in detail, but I'm sure most of you understand why. It's also something that several other states do. It's something that's done quite routinely in the US, and the value of having that data is massive. But there's also some concerns around confidentiality. So I'm really just spelling out the key issues, and I'll talk about what we've done in that space. So with the new reporting guideline, you'll see it has, that was released as of 31st of October. It has a new look and feel, so it's an improved design and formatting. It's very streamlined. It's better navigation. So before, the way we've structured the guideline is actually broken it down into modular components, and that allows those components to be used amongst various different report types, and I'll discuss how that actually works. But it was a little bit challenging to navigate between, okay, here's the report and here's what's required, the various different components, but I need to keep scrolling back and forwards from those components to the report to understand what do I need to include, and also what is mandatory and what we're also, determining as best practice or good practice. The language being concise and consistent, we developed a common requirement. So there was a lot of duplication in the reporting guideline originally, and what we wanted to take is all those common elements and pull them to the very front. So it just made it a bit easier to say, well, for every report, this is what's required. We'll have things on units, for example, with depth that have to be reported in meters, and other things that are common to every report. And the legislative references need to be incorporated in a way that was very useful. So with the final reporting guideline, we have removed the operational summaries for producing wells. What we really want to focus on is getting the well level production data, and we don't want to burden industry unnecessarily by collecting information that in a way that's probably not all that useful. But what we have introduced are some optional fields in the template that can be populated to provide some contextual information, and I'll talk about that later. Mandatory and best practice information is now well defined. The mandatory information being that which is in the regulation. It specifies what is actually the minimum amount of information needed in that report, but there's also a lot of other information which we consider to be good practice to report. We wanted to improve the raw and native data submissions, so give an example for well testing information, the time and pressure data that's collected from that is quite obviously very useful and is needed for interpretation. So we wanted to also reduce the low value interpretation requirements. I go into that in a bit of detail, but I'll move on to the next point. We haven't changed the current reserves and production reporting requirements. We'll continue to operate with the 6 monthly reports, but we're also introducing optional, or what we're considering good practice at this stage, well level production. And we have the non-mandatory submission of additional resources information, and as I said, the well production information as well, until the regulatory changes have been made. With that, there's obviously the need for continuous engagement, so we do plan on doing a lot more of that in the new year. Just to give you a bit of a background on the history, with 2016, we started looking at mainly what we call the activity-based reports, so it's well completion, well abandonment, seismic survey, and also inclusion of the production and reserves reports. In 2017, we tried to include everything, and what we came back with is that the relinquishment, surrender, and end of tenure reports had a lot of common alignments with the Mineral Resources Act. In fact, they actually describe the same thing, but they're providing slightly different information, or how that's interpreted is different. So rather than creating a unique requirement for petroleum, I saw a real good opportunity to be able to align those requirements across commodities so that we were consistent in that approach, and as such we have removed those from this guideline. It also didn't really work as well with the formatting of how that guideline was structured, so I think it was a good opportunity for us to take out, pull it back, and then look at aligning that with the coal and minerals requirements. In the guideline, you'll see for each report type, this is the way it's structured. So it's a fairly simple table. It gives you the legislative reference from the Act and the relevant regulation references. It provides the lodgement time frame. So in this case, it's for example, with the petroleum production report, it's 40 business days after the 6-month period ends. It has the confidentiality period, and it talks about the report structure. And in this case, you can see this report actually doesn't really have any body to it. It is just data files. And in those data files, there are two that you see that are mandatory. One is the actual petroleum production data, and the other is the water analysis. Everything else at this stage we consider as good practice, and it does provide a lot of that contextual information that I was mentioning before. It also tracks life cycle. For example, with perforations, we may not actually get that data if it was perforated after the well had been completed. So we need to be able to provide another place where that perforation data can be received. It does often come in during a hydraulic fracturing activities report, but this is now another avenue for that information to be gathered. So if you go into the actual detail of each one of those components, you'll see data, petroleum production. So this is the example here. In data petroleum production, you have minimum information. It lists the number of things. It talks about the cumulative volumes. It talks about the reporting by field, by reservoir, by 6 months. And then you have the good practice requirements, or good industry practice, as we like to say. And that gives a lot of information on that provides information on those other requirements that we'd really like to receive. So the well level production data broken down into the various components and so on by reservoir. So it provides a better granularity. It's monthly data. So going on to the submission templates. So I guess what we're really trying to create is an environment where we can make better use of the information that we receive, improve the efficiency and such. And the templates become a very important part of that because it's about how that information is transferred to us. It's about the standards that are used. So I'll click on that. So just to give you an example how the templates are structured, we start out with some notes. We have a validation dictionary, so this provides some of the drop-down menus. And then we have an example of a well card. So it's got these field names that are used in the templates are based off of the PPDM data model. So that's the Petroleum Professional Data Management Association. It is an international standard that's fairly well recognized and it's fairly well used. Rather than creating our own standard for reporting information, we thought it was quite important to use a common language. It's particularly important if you're looking at international investment. You've got companies that have to come in, they have to extract this data, and the easiest way to be able to do that is to provide them in a language that's easy to recognize. But we've also provided a lot more definition that provides a bit more of the Queensland context. Just to remove some of the artifacts that are more specific to North America, we've had to adapt those definitions. But the actual field names themselves are as generally as they are in the PPDM data model. And if the PPDM data model didn't specify the field names, we've created ones based on the same structure, the same format. So in this you can see there's a lot of information that's reported in here about the well, the well's design, the status, its shut-off type, so how it was left abandoned, or suspended, operator, rig name, lease information, location, and so on. So a lot of that is already reported to us in a report at the moment. Some of it isn't. One question we do get a lot about is targets and basins. So it's not that easy for us to work out without going into the detail what a well is actually targeting. So this actually provides us a way of the company reporting to us, we're actually targeting this basin, or we might be targeting multiple basins in one well, or we might be targeting multiple targets in one basin, and so on. So it provides that level of clarity. We can do stats on this as well, which makes it very useful, and it's actually quite a common question that we get. I'll give you an example of some drill bit information. There's, again, quite a bit of detail in here, some which is mandatory and some which is optional, again, based on the PPDM data model. The well log template. I don't need to go through this in a lot of detail, but you can see that there's a lot of metadata in there rather than data. I think the analysis table to me is a fairly important one. One of the challenges we have is about ensuring that we've received all the analytical data that has been collected on a well. So this sample batch or batch analysis table allows us to be able to track. So we can see if a report has come in. For example, you've got an end date. So if there's an end date on a particular set of analysis, that report is then ready. We should have received that report with the well completion report. In this case, at the time when this example was created, there were no end dates, but we knew that these analyses had been run in that well, and then we can follow up at a later time after the well completion report is submitted to ask for that data. I know there's other ways around it, but this provides a little bit more flexibility. It provides a lot more transparency for us to know what has been collected on a well and whether we need to go back to the company. Then we get to some results tables. So we've got a number of type results tables for analytical data. And again, I won't go into that, but it provides some basic level metadata on the samples that were analyzed and obviously the key results. It doesn't capture everything, and that wasn't the intention. The intention was to capture the key metadata and data from those tests so that we could standardize that information and we could ingest that information. Of course, we can then provide that back. So with that, I guess to summarize, what are the next steps? Well, we have released the Petroleum and Gas Reporting Guideline that happened on the 31st of October. And now we're in this period of what we call transition. And this transition period is really important because what we need to do is actually get the users to test these templates. We need them to test the new requirements under the reporting guidelines and get as much feedback as we can to understand very early what that transition is going to look like. And that'll be different for different companies depending on their systems and their processes and obviously resources as well. So what we plan to do very early next year is run a series of industry workshops. We have defined what those workshops will look like and are getting in the stage of preparing the release of the flyers to go out to representatives of various companies so that we can get some participation. There's a demonstration of piloting the automated data ingestion validation, and that's through the Geoscience Data Modernization Project. So we're actually going to take some of that data that's being received in the templates and we're going to test it. And we also want to test what we can do with it. So there'll be some work around doing analytics, statistics, and so on. We need to introduce some amendments to the regulation. So in that, we need to decide of those things that are sitting in good practice, which will move into mandatory. We need to remove any duplication that's in place. For example, if we move to well-level production, do we actually need to have 6-monthly cumulative production? And then any fine-tuning and adjustments to the guidelines and templates, we still have a little bit of time because ideally what we want to do is implement in 2020. So whilst we've had some consultation, whilst we've had some external review, we've had some internal testing of the templates, we want to get that external view and a bit more testing before we move into full implementation. And that summarized my presentation. Thank you.